Hello, everyone. I'm Sheila Ager, Dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Waterloo. And I'd like to extend to you all a very warm welcome to this first event in the Indigenous Speaker Series this academic year. Now, before I go any further, I want to draw to your attention the fact that we've arranged for simultaneous translation of the event into American Sign Language. Many thanks to Debbie Parliament for carrying this out. If you follow the link in the Q&A section of the event window, it'll open up a second window where you'll see the ASL translation. The Indigenous Speaker Series is run through the collaboration of the Faculty of Arts with the Waterloo Indigenous Student Centre, with organizers also from the Departments of History and Communication Arts and the Offices of Indigenous Relations and Research. Although it's too bad that we still can't be all together, one of the advantages of a virtual event is that we can record it and people will be able to access that recording and watch it at their leisure. Now, although we're not yet able to be at the university, and although running the event remotely means that we're reaching an audience that's scattered far and wide, this is a University of Waterloo event, and so it's appropriate and essential to acknowledge the history of the land that has been home to the University of Waterloo for over 60 years. UW acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and it's centralized within our Office of Indigenous Relations. Now, more than a simple statement, the territorial acknowledgement should provide a pause for reflection, especially at this time when we're all so distanced from each other. Many of you here today are probably on land of Indigenous significance, quite apart from the Six Nations location of the University of Waterloo. So I'd like to acknowledge also, however briefly, the history of these other territories across the whole of Turtle Island. And this brings me to expressing my sincere thanks and welcome to today's distinguished guest, Jean Teillet, lawyer, author, teacher, and artist, who joins us from traditional First Nations territories that Jean herself will be acknowledging. Jadam Hunt, Interim Director of the Waterloo Indigenous Student Centre, will be giving a full introduction to Jean Teillet shortly. Right now, though, as part of the traditional setting of the Indigenous Speaker Series, Wanda Kidd will perform a welcome song. Wanda is an undergraduate student in the Faculty of Arts, majoring in theatre and performance. She is also an executive member of the Indigenous Students Association, an assistant at the Waterloo Indigenous Student Centre, and a peer mentor to Indigenous first-year students living at St. Paul's College. Thank you, everyone, and again, welcome.
I would like to thank Wanda for taking the time to do that song. That was really lovely, the Woman's Warrior song. And Sego Sewagwego, Jadam Andayan. My name is Jadam Hunt, and I'm Bay of Quinte Mohawk from Six Nations as well as European ancestry. I'm currently the interim director of the Waterloo Indigenous Student Centre, and I'm grateful to be here today to facilitate this conversation with Jean Teillet. So Jean Teillet is Red River Métis, an Indigenous rights lawyer and great-grandniece of Louis Riel. Jean was foundational in founding the Métis Nation of Ontario, the Métis Lawyers Association, holds numerous awards and honors, and 3 honorary doctorates. Jean is a senior counsel with Pape Salter Teillet LLP, who has long been engaged in negotiations and litigations with provincial and federal governments concerning Métis and First Nation land rights, harvesting rights, and government. With the release of her book, The Northwest is Our Mother, in 2019, Jean shares the story of Louis Riel's people and the Métis Nation. Today, we are honored to hear from and have a conversation with Jean Teillet about the rich history of who the Métis people are, where they are, what is happening today and into the future. She will also share stories from the process of writing her book, The Northwest is Our Mother. Please join me in welcoming Jean Teillet.
So I would start by saying thank you, Wanda, for the beautiful song, and thank you, Jada, for that kind introduction. And to acknowledge that I am actually currently on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples in British Columbia, specifically in Vancouver, where you're reading about all the flooding and the rain. But I'm originally, my home is what we call Red River. I was literally born on the banks of the Red River, right at the forks of the Red and the Assiniboine in what is now called Winnipeg. And I lived until I was into my 20s, right there in Saint-Vital and St. Boniface. And I am a member of 3 sort of traditional Métis families, and I'll tell you, so most people know me as a Riel. My grandmother was Sarah Riel, and her father was Joseph Riel. My great-grandfather was Joseph Riel, and Joseph was Louis Riel's little brother. And when Louis was hanged, it's my great-grandfather who went to Regina and, well, Saskatchewan actually, and gathered Louis's wife and his 2 kids and brought them back to St. Boniface and cared for them, raised those kids, and looked after Louis's wife. And but my great-grandfather was married to Eleanor Poitras. So the Poitrases are also a very well-known Métis family name. And Eleanor Poitras is the granddaughter of Cuthbert Grant's sister. Now, if you're part of the Métis Nation, all of those names, Cuthbert Grant and the Poitrases and the Riels, will ring in your ears as major. I see Jade as a Mohawk from Bay of Quinte. It'd be like saying you're a Hill or a Brant, right? You know, from your folks, right? So those names would ring as family names to all people in the Métis Nation. So that's just by way of introducing me. Now, Jada kindly said that I would tell you the history of the Métis Nation, who the Métis Nation is, what's going on and everything, and I would have to tell you we'd be here for a month if I could give you all of that information. It's probably, as much as I'd like to, there's no short way to do all of that. So if you want to know the history of the Métis Nation, I have to tell you, read my book, because it is I know it's 500 pages, but it is the story of the Métis Nation. So the reason the book is there is because most people in Canada know all about Louis Riel. Maybe they don't know everything about him, but they know who he is. They recognize his name. And I think it's quite unusual that most Canadians, Louis Riel is in fact the only Indigenous leader's name they can name when they pull it out of a hat. I think that's a terrible thing because, there are hundreds of wonderful leaders. Each Indigenous people has several leaders that all Canadians should know. But so for me, the issue was that for the Métis Nation, it's flipped. So say for the Mohawks, people know the Mohawks. They may not know their story in great detail, but they know the people. They know them by name. They know vaguely where they are. They know where the Cree are vaguely. They know where the Mi'kmaq are. Nobody knows about the Métis Nation. They don't have a clue. They know our leaders, like our most famous leader, Louis Riel, but they don't know anything about his people, where they are, and their history. And that was the purpose of writing the book. So, basically, to give you a basic geographic idea, the Métis Nation is primarily centered on the prairies, right? So Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and it does not go past the Rocky Mountains. That's kind of a natural barrier for it. And in Eastern Canada, it sort of wanders a little bit into what we know now as Ontario, but essentially stops at the height of land west of Lake Superior. So you're talking about a little tuck into northwestern Ontario, and that's about it. Now, it did go, before we had the American border, well into the United States because the people were largely engaged in buffalo hunting. And the buffalo, of course, didn't stop at artificial invisible lines. And so the Métis were well into what is now North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, all that plains area, because they followed the buffalo. And it's as simple as that. So the northern branch of the Métis are the people who are the descendants of the voyageurs, and they moved along the waters and lakes and rivers in the northern parts of the province. So what we call the boreal forest today. So that's the northern branch. And both branches are heavily related. You would have one branch of the family being a voyageur and the other one's down on the buffalo hunt, and then they'd flip or join each other. And a lot of the purpose of the buffalo hunt for many, many, many years was to make pemmican, which is a condensed meat that's very, very high in protein, something like what we call jerky today. And that fed the voyageurs. So the buffalo hunt and the voyageurs are intimately connected in their lifestyle, by family, and by geographic territory. So that's kind of when I talk about the Northwest, that's what I mean. I mean the area sort of from the height of land west of Lake Superior to the Rockies, from the Manitoba US border, just because we're just going to talk about Canada today, up to the bottom of Great Slave Lake. That's the turf that we're talking about as the Northwest. So what I wanted to do, though, is I'm going to share some slides, so bear with me for a second while I try and do technological things. Now, perhaps, Jada, you could nod at me if you can see the slide, and I'll put it into presenter view. Now, I'm hoping I can't see anyone, so I'm going to assume.
I can't
Can
see
you
the
see it?
slide yet, not yet.
Okay. All right, let me try this again. Can you see it now?
Not yet.
Oh dear, we're gonna have issues, are we? I will probably then have to chat without, I thought we had this fixed, but you're not seeing anything?
I'm not seeing anything at the moment. I'm seeing you still.
Yeah, well, you're still not seeing anything, eh?
Oh, now I am seeing something. Yes, it's come up.
Okay,
And
maybe
it's showing it. Yes, perfect. Now the presenter view. Awesome. There we go.
Okay, so let me just go back to the beginning here. So, classic picture of Louis Riel. So, I'm showing you this house because this is called Riel House. This is a museum in Winnipeg right now in St. Vital. It's on the banks of the Red River. And this is a house that I knew when I was a little kid, because it wasn't a museum yet. It didn't look like this, because after my Uncle Roger and my family decided that that Riel House should go to part of the Canadian history, and so I think they sold it to the federal government for $1, and so that it would become a museum. And then after that, the museum folks stripped it and restored it back to what it would have looked like in the 1870s. So when I was a little girl playing in this house with my great auntie Vaughn lived here, it didn't look like this, but this is sort of the restoration, and it's called Riel House, which I think is a little bit of a misnomer, because you see something called Riel House, you would assume that it's Louis Riel's house, but it isn't. It's my great-grandfather Joseph's house. Louis never lived here. But something important happened in this house in 1909. And right here, so this is a little bit blurry photo. I'm sorry, my photographic skills are not the best, but it gives you an idea of what they've restored it to look like. But in this room, this very room in 1909, a group of men met, and I call them the Old Wolves, but they met here in 1909, and they decided to write the history of the Métis Nation, which up until then had been only an oral history. And in that room were quite a few men. Like I said, I call them the Old Wolves. Here's a few of them. The picture of Ambrose Lepine in the middle is actually a picture of him as quite a bit younger man. On the left side is my great-grandfather Joseph Riel. On the right is André No. These three men are really well-known and respected Métis leaders. But this is what I call them, the Old Wolves. Nobody else calls them that. It was just it just kept coming to me as I looked at these guys. So in French, they called them les anciens, meaning, you know, the old ones. In Michif, we would call them les vieux, and or les fidèles à Riel, meaning, you know, Riel's compatriots, or the people who honored Riel, right, or followed Riel. So this is, these are the men who were participants in and supporters of the two, what the Canadian public call the Riel rebellions. And we reject the word rebellion and say they were resistance movements. But these are the men, these are them in 1910. And there's another picture, I'm just going to skip to this one. This is them meeting in 1913. And I've picked out with the red arrows a few of the prominent men, but you'll see in the bottom, right at the bottom, the guy who looks kind of like Charlie Chaplin is my grandfather, Camille Teillet. My great-grandfather is up in just up above and to the right, Joseph Riel. And some of the other, Guillaume Charette way up at the back is probably the second Métis lawyer. We call him the old storyteller. André No, the man with the big beard, is very, very famous Métis leader. You saw him in an earlier picture. Ambrose Lepine, there's an older picture of Ambrose Lepine, and Elzia Lajemodière. These are all of the men in this room. These are the famous Métis names. You'll see the Nos, the Larocques, the Lajemodières, the Vermets, the Riels, the Lepines, Goulets, Carrières. These are all family names that have gone down through the ages. Now, November 16th, these men are meeting on the anniversary of the hanging of Louis Riel. He was hanged on November 16th. So it's no accident that they're all together here on that particular day. So just to show you that there's, in the early 20th century, there's a lot of stuff going on. Now, the big Métis, the big Northwest resistance, which was after which many of these men ended up in prison, and they hanged Louis Riel in 1885. After that, the Métis did meet. They started within 2 years. So we tend to call that, after 1885, le grand silence, the time when everybody was silenced. But really, they started meeting again 2 years later in 1887. And in 1891, they erected this monument on the grounds of the St. Boniface Basilica, still there today, and this sign acknowledging him as president of the provisional government. They erected an altar, they started meeting, they started publishing. But one of the things that that happened, as I said, when they met in 1909 in that room, was that they decided to write their own history. And by way of an early foray, and now I know you can't read this, and probably most of you can't read the French, but what happened was one of their early forays into the public realm again. So you have to remember, the Métis were vilified after 1885. They were chased and hounded and watched and not allowed to basically meet. But they were so whenever they were meeting on the quiet. And for them to stand up, even in the 1920s, and start saying things publicly, was considered outrageous, because the colonial story had already been put out there by the priests, by the soldiers, by the government, and nobody wanted to hear what the Métis said really happened from their perspective. People only wanted to hear the story that was put forward by the sort of colonial winners, right? And we all know that the winners get to write history, and there's nowhere is that more true than in this situation here. So they had a big meeting in 1923, and Guillaume Charette, I think I pointed him out in that picture earlier, he got up and he started to tell the story of what happened, and the outrage was huge. So I've just clipped a couple of newspaper articles here where they're fighting back, right? The newspapers are fighting back, and it's the UNM is the Union Nationale Métis. That's the organization that they created. And this is the fight coming back, and who's the leader of it? A priest who's coming back and arguing and saying that no, what they're saying isn't right. So they then worked really hard to publish a book, and this is the book, the first book they published. They hired Auguste de Trémondin to write the book. Unfortunately, he died just before, well, it was mostly written, but he died before it was published. It ended up getting published finally in 1935. My grandfather was part of the historic committee that ended up pushing it through to publication. It was very hard to get it published. Nobody wanted to touch it. Only this one small publisher in Quebec agreed to publish it, and then, even then they had to pay for it. So no one else would touch it, and they published a few copies, and then the warehouse burned down. So this is a very rare and unique copy here that is probably almost impossible. You probably would never find it. And there is an English translation out that the Manitoba Métis Federation put out in, I think, 1968, called Hold Higher Heads. So it is available in English. So when I started writing this book, I was looking for information, of course, and I remembered that when I was a kid, we had a bunch of Riel papers at home. So in fact, my brothers and I all remember taking them to show and tell when we were in like grade 4 and 5. And so when I was writing this, so this is like 2016, I went home to Winnipeg and I said to my mom, do you have those Riel papers around somewhere? Do you remember those? And she said, oh yeah, they're over there on the shelf. So I pulled them down and I looked at them, and there were a few things in there, not a lot of it not really terribly important. And when I say Riel papers, I don't necessarily mean that everything was written by Riel, but it's about and around all of those events. So then I asked my mom if she thought any of my cousins had anything, and she said, I don't know, you'll have to ask them. So I sent out a blast to all my cousins, and Peter came back from my cousin Louise, who said, oh yeah, I have 9 boxes of papers in the basement. So my friend, historian, Dr. Arthur Ray, just sort of tore his hair out when I told him that. And he said, you know, that's a historian's worst nightmare, that 9 boxes of Riel papers are sitting in somebody's basement in a flood zone, which is Winnipeg. So I went, when I was in Winnipeg next, I went to my cousins, and my brother and my cousin and her husband, so 4 of us, spent about 3 days going through all the boxes and just taking photographs of everything. So literally we're standing there with cameras looking at it, like click, next page, click, next page, click, next page, all of us doing this. It took us, I think, 3 full days to go through everything in there. And it was a gold mine of information. So some of it was things written by Riel, some of them are affidavits by other Métis. It was a fascinating collection of papers. I'll tell you now that it has now been handed over to the St. Boniface archives. And my mother has handed over the papers that we had as well. So, but this is the journal that caught my eye. It was very, it's a big old, it's a ledger actually. And it's quite large. It's probably, you know, 17 inches by 11 or something like that. Maybe, yeah, 11 by 17. It's a very large ledger. The leather is that gorgeous old burgundy color. It had sort of gilt edges on it, but of course it's well over 100 years old. And when you opened it up, the spine is broken and the pages kind of slip out. And it's actually a ledger, even though my grandfather used it to keep his notes in. And that was interesting to me too, because one of the things that really became clear to me as I was doing my research was something that we don't even think about today, because paper is cheap and readily available today. But what I saw was that these old wolves, they wrote on every tiny scrap of paper they could find. The notes are on bizarre kinds of paper. They use every inch of the paper for the most part. Sometimes they write over it going one direction and then write over it the other way, going the other direction, because paper was so scarce. So I think the fact that my grandfather is writing in this journal, in what is a ledger book, is because that's what he had to write in. So I'm just going to show you what it looked like. Now, I have to say that sometimes this was, you know, really difficult, right? So first of all, he writes 90% of it in pencil. I found myself going, Pape, couldn't you at least have written in pen so that I could still see it? He also has a sort of a spidery scrawl. And of course, this is turn of the century, or actually, because he's actually, you know, speaking, you know, late 1800s, early 1900s French, which is not the French we speak today. So there's a few terms in here that I would have to go to my friend who was a translator, and she'd say, where'd you dig up that word? Nobody's used that for 100 years. And I say, yeah, that's exactly right. It was 1908. So, but if you look at this, this is an affidavit. And it's probably, so I should just make it clear, this is a copy of an affidavit, because you got to remember back in 1908, nobody had photocopy machines or anything, right? So the only way to copy something was to sit and copy it down by hand. So this is my grandfather copying an affidavit, and I've, you know, at the top I'm giving you easier to read. It's a sworn declaration of André No, Elzia Lajmodier, and Duncan McDougall, and it's taken in 1908. And if you look down at the bottom corner, you'll see on the second page, Témoin Camille Teillet, that means witnessed by Camille Teillet, that's my grandfather. Above it, you'll see André No signed with an X in the middle, which likely means that he couldn't write. And it's commissioned by Joseph Dumas. And you've got the date, the 22nd of December, 1908. And it's them telling a particular story about what happened in one of the resistance movements. So that's kind of what the journal looked like. And it took me a long time when I was looking at it to even figure out what on earth I was looking at, because, you know, you just pick it out of this box and you pick up this big piece of, you know, it's got all kinds of things in it, and I didn't know what I was looking at. But really what I came to the conclusion after was that what I was looking at was the notes and the attempt to organize the facts of their history. So, and they did it a lot by interviewing and taking sworn declarations by all the old guys who were alive at the time. So they went to Batoche in 1929 and they took all kinds of affidavits from people. These are all in the St. Boniface archives. You can read them. And then there are copies here. And some of the copies here are obviously, as I said, copies of documents that you can't find the originals of anymore. So don't know where they are or if they'll show up at any point, but it's very interesting. It also has, now I know this is hard to read because the light's quite dark on it, and I'm not expecting you to read it, but what this is the meeting notes of a meeting. So again, this is a copy of the notes of a meeting at Riel House on September 28th and October 5th, 1871. Now this is a really important document because this is a meeting when all of the Métis leaders are supposed to be in exile in the United States. They're not even supposed to be in Manitoba. And it's also the Fenian invasion is imminent. And what this meeting is about is whether the Métis will come on side with Manitoba and protect Manitoba, or whether they'll go and do another resistance with the joining forces with the Fenians. And you have to understand, this is not a slam dunk decision for these men who are meeting, because we're in the middle of what we call the Reign of Terror. Actually, it's not, we don't just call it the Reign of Terror. The New York Times called it the Reign of Terror. These are the troops that Sir Johnny MacDonald sent to a totally peaceful community who raped, murdered, and savaged, burned, and destroyed the Métis in Manitoba for a 3-year period and did nothing. So the Prime Minister inflicted this, knew about it, and left it there. And I would say the fact that the New York Times in 1871 ran a headline, I would guess today that even today, in 2021, probably 90% of the New York Times readership don't know where Red River is. They probably didn't know back in 1871 either, except that vaguely it's somewhere out west, right? So for the New York Times to run a headline in 1871 about the Reign of Terror going on, and they called it a military reign of terror, that means it was serious and that everybody knew about it, and our Prime Minister did absolutely nothing. So this meeting is in the middle of all their people having their houses burned. Riel's mother and sister had their home invasion. They put a gun to his sister's head. They gang raped Lorette Goulet. They did, like, there are terrible, terrible things that went on every day in this reign of terror. And in the middle of it, the Métis have to decide whether they're going to support those men who are raping and burning and murdering them. So this is a huge meeting going on, and I'm just going to zone in a little bit on the list here. So this is the list of who's there. So if you look up on the, you can see André Nault. It's interesting how they spell it. It's N-E-A-U-L-T. We don't put the E in anymore. But anyway, Louis Riel. So Louis Riel, André Nault, Ambrose Lepine, Pierre Lavallée, all these guys, they're supposed to be in exile in the United States, right? They're not even supposed to be over the border here. So this is a very secret meeting, and this is the who's who of the Métis leadership, who are there from all of the communities around. So these are from all of the small parishes in this area, and they're deciding at this meeting what they're going to do. about this. And afterwards, the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba says that if the Métis had gone with the Fenians, Manitoba would have been lost. It was really clear decision as to which, because they were the ones, despite the fact that they were under siege from the army, they were organized, and they could have either stopped the Fenians, or if they joined with them, they could have taken over Manitoba again. So it was very tense at a time, and an important time, and it's fascinating to me that we have copies of the notes and a list of even who was at the meeting. Now they then went back to their communities because these men said, look, we can't make this classic Indigenous leadership, right? We don't make decisions on behalf of our people. We go to our people and we get them to tell us what they want us to do, and we'll do it, right? This is very different from Western leadership style, where Western leaders tell you what they're going to do, and you either vote them out next time or not. This is totally different way. So they all went back to their communities, had big meetings to decide, got the people to decide what they wanted, and they all then met again a couple of days later and said, okay, my community said this, my community said that, etc. So it's classic Indigenous leadership going on here. And these notes are a gold mine about that. So I think I'm probably running close to time here. So I wanted to just leave you, I could go on and on with these, with the papers, but I'm going to leave you with some of the photos because there are just a few more papers and things. I just wanted to briefly show you some of the things that are there. So this is actually Sarah's grave, not my grandmother. My grandmother's named after this Sarah. So this Sarah was a nun, and she's Louis and my great-grandfather Joseph's sister. And she was a nun up in Ile-à-la-Crosse. She died in 1883. And she was Louis's favorite, closest, most beloved sister, and also my great-grandfather's, and that's why he named his oldest daughter, my grandmother, after Sarah. You can still see this if you ever chance to be up in Ile-à-la-Crosse. You can still see her grave. Now that's actually me down in the corner, but this is St. Peter's Mission in Montana. So for those of you who know the story, when Gabriel Dumont and the other three men went down in 1884 to ask Louis to come up to lead what eventually became the Northwest Resistance of 1885, this is where he was. He was in Mass, at Mass, in this tiny little chapel. It's a really beautiful little chapel. It's on private property in Montana today. And he was in here, he came out from Mass to meet them, told them he wanted to finish going to Mass, and then he'd talk to them. They met, they told him they wanted him to come back to Canada to help his people, and he said he needed to think about it. So he came and he prayed and thought about it all night in this very room here. Now you can see, if you can see that little metal bar running across the middle of the picture, that's actually holding the building up these days because it's not in the best of condition. But it is a beautiful, beautiful little chapel, and it is still there as well. If you're ever down that way, you can go look at it. And this is a copy of a telegraph that I found in my grandfather's papers, and I gave you a rough reading of the French. Basically, this is when Louis he's surrendered, he's in custody, he's about to face trial, and August? No, I think his trial's over. So he's writing, and Joseph is my great-grandfather saying to him, you know, I really want you to keep those papers for me. And the part about his wife is really going to collect Louis's wife, who was pregnant, had 2 small children, and had TB all at the same time, and had just gone through this war. So this is my great-grandfather's going out to get her and bring her back. So I thought this was a rather poignant, but the most poignant piece of paper I found in all my grandfather's papers was this. This is and I'll leave you with this one. This is a receipt of what Louis had on his person when he surrendered, and you'll see it's a Pigot is the constable, acting provost sergeant. And so this is a list of what Louis had. He had a religious book. I think that's a very weird way of spelling toque. 2 pairs of wool mitts, 2 pencils, sundry papers, 1 newspaper, 1 cloak, 1 pencil, and his marriage certificate. And so one of the most famous men in Canadian history, who was revered by his own people because he didn't seek his own personal wealth or to advance his own position, but spent his whole life working for his people. This is what he had. This is what he owned at the end of his life. And I find it sad, but interesting that he's carrying his marriage certificate. So that is the presentation that I was going to make, and I wanted to leave it open for some dialogue. So I'm going to pass it back to the rest of the team, and I'll close this off if I can figure out how. Okay, are you back? Can you still see my screen, or is it gone?
Your screen is gone now, Jean.
Good.
Thank you so much. That ended up working out well. So yeah, wow, that was a lot of information, and I really appreciate you making a point to say in the beginning, you know, that if we were going to go into the depth, like it would take a long time, right? And just, you know, to get to the book, which, you know, I haven't had the chance to completely read, and so I do look forward to indulging in that more thoroughly. But wow, just everything that you shared there was very rich. And so, you know, in regards to all of the documents that you had found and been exposed to through family, I was interested in knowing too a part about how that had possibly impacted yourself and your own knowing and indigeneity. Like, did you feel like in discovering those documents and going through them for the research of your book that changed you as a person? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think the thing that it brought home most clearly to me was that the past isn't past, that it's, you know, I'm still walking in the same story that my grandfather walked in, and my great-grandfather, and my great-great-grandmother, and all of these people. I'm still in that story, and that I don't think I had appreciated that as much at all. And some of I have to say, I often felt like I was walking with ghosts while I was writing this story, because, you know, you can't sit and deeply try and think and feel what it's like to be in a particular situation without that happening. I'm sure that happens to all writers who are, you know, writing. And wasn't writing a novel, but, you know, you're still trying to convey the feeling of what it's like, and there are real highs and lows in these stories, and it has everything. The stories, it's a Hollywood movie almost. The only thing I couldn't find was a good sex scandal. Other than that, it's got everything. Like, there's corrupt politicians and you know, land speculators and priests, and, you know, there's just like there's everything. There's even a legless lawyer character walking around there in the 1870s who's just fascinating. He's absolutely a fascinating. I try to wrap my brain around what it would be like to, and he was born without legs apparently, and but became a lawyer in the 1870s. You just sort of sit there and try and imagine what it's like in a place where it's winter 8 months of the year, and the 2 more months of mucky weather, and you can't walk. There's no cement roads or sidewalks. It's just like, how do you get around? How do you live in those circumstances if you have that kind of physical body to deal with your whole life? And yet he's a brilliant lawyer, and I actually think he's Louis Riel's legal advisor, but I didn't put it in the book because it's one of those, when you're writing these kinds of stories, you find 5,000 amazing side roads that you can wander down, and you have to rein yourself in and just go, whoa, okay.
Yes.
I go down that one for 2 years and lose track of where I'm actually going. So there were a lot of stories like, his name was Enos Stutzman, that I was going, wow, if I had a little more evidence, I would have put that in, but it would require more digging on him. But anyway, just to say, my own indigeneity, my own sense of my people, my own sense of my place with my people was greatly enriched by this opportunity.
Yes, definitely. I can only imagine. And yeah, I have a tendency too to go, you know, when I was writing my thesis, it's like I get into one area and I just end up being down a rabbit hole there, and I'm going, oh my goodness, like I need to reel it back in, stay on track, right? But
it's true. So my track that I kept pulling myself back to was, okay, I'm telling the story of when the people acted as a people or as a collective in their own interests, either to advance their own interests or to protect their own interests. But when they're acting as a collective, that's what, now there are individual stories in it, but basically that's the trajectory of the book. So things like the Enos Stutzman story, that's like, oh, okay, well, and the other one is spies. There were spies all over the place in this. There were British spies, there were Irish spies, there were American spies, there were Scottish spies, there were Canadian spies, there were French spies, they were all over the map. And I was just fascinated by the spies. They're running around everywhere. But again, that's a real sidetrack. You know?
Right. But it is fascinating and unbelievable, really, right? Like, it's like, wow. And it's interesting. So, you know, in my own journey of self-discovery and coming to, you know, learn about my indigeneity later in life, you know, in the very beginning, when I was going through the process of that, you know, I thought, oh, I'm Métis because I'm part Indigenous and part European, right? Like, this was the narrative that I had thought. And then as I went down and found out, you know, I'm Mohawk and all of that. But, you know, one of the things that you talked about too was the Métis being vilified, and after 1885. And so I know, I just wondered if some of the people might not be familiar that are with us today in regards to why they were vilified. And, you know, that doesn't have to, I know that's probably a long, in-depth thing, but could you touch on that at all?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of reasons. Some of it is flat out racism, because let's put it this way. I think Jim Morrison said the Métis were too Indian, too French, and too Catholic. So, like, if you had two of those, you're probably okay, but we're like 3 strikes and you're out kind of thing. And so we're too Indian for, and again, this is as against and I realize that I'm talking to people from the University of Waterloo. You're in sort of the heart of Anglo-Saxon Ontario, but that's really that idea, is that sort of white Protestant supremacy concept that was driving the colonial project for the most part. And so the Métis and those white Protestant supremacists really had a very strong idea about the beginnings of eugenics kind of concept, which is that the mixing of the races was a violation of everything that they believed in. And so the Métis, being the product of that, are just like that. We're like the worst of the worst. They pitied Indians, but the Métis were just, you're a violation of anything that should ever exist. So that's a lot of what's going on.
Right.
And you have to remember that the Ontario was largely run by the Orange Lodge in those days. The Orange Lodge is still in existence today. So every mayor of Toronto for 100 years was a member of the Orange Lodge. Sir John A. Macdonald was a member of the Orange Lodge. 2/3 of the men, the white Protestant men in Canada, which is the bulk of them, were members of the Orange Lodge. And the Orange Lodge was nothing but a very blatant white supremacist organization. Later, when the Ku Klux Klan comes to Canada, they blend in here really well because they just sit right comfortably right on top of the Orange Lodge, which already believes all the things that the Ku Klux Klan believes. So these guys, and like I said, this is Sir John A. Macdonald. This is all the mayors of Toronto, these are the judges, these are the lawyers, these are the police chiefs, and they had a plan, and they weren't shy about it, and it's published plan called Ascendancy, that they were going to take over, and everybody who was in positions of power was going to be one of them. And so when they came out west, they're the ones who signed up to become the militia that was sent out to the Reign of Terror. And they took vows to exterminate the Métis, literally took vows.
Wow.
And they did it. So, and then afterwards, when the battle moves to Saskatchewan, it's basically a rerun of the same thing. They're trying to take the Métis lands and resources. They go west. Then you've got the same thing, same cast of characters. Sir Johnny Macdonald is still the Prime Minister. All the people that he sent to Manitoba have now moved on as land speculators into Saskatchewan. It's just a rerun of the same story. So that's part of it, and that carries over into the written histories. So later, when we get not W.L. Morton, A. Morton, who writes one of the first big histories, I think it's in 1939, about these are the guys who are writing the colonial story that you probably learned in school, which is George Stanley, Arthur Morton, and then later W.L. Morton. They're like the major historians. They're the ones who set that this is when you learn in school what your history is of the takeover of what is now 2/3 of Canada. That's the story you learn. Well, Morton hated the French. This is the Arthur Morton who wrote it. He hated the French. He was one of those classic guys who thought that the Métis shouldn't exist because you shouldn't mix the races. And yet we're supposed to accept that his history and say it didn't influence his telling of the story. And I think it does. It really does. And Stanley, whose book is still being taught, he says that this was the clash of civilizations, of the civilized people against the primitive savages. Okay, well, whoa, what a framework. But that's the framework that is still being taught, that's still accepted as balanced. That's the word people use. If you don't include that history in your history, then you are, like I am, accused of not writing a balanced history, because their history, where you are a savage and you are uncivilized, and that they're civilized and they're, the manifest destiny of taking over society. If you don't accept that and you try to write in a different framework, you are writing unbalanced, biased material. And that's what people say about me. I'm writing unbalanced, balanced. Of course, all their stuff is totally balanced.
Right. It's like, wow. Yeah, that's not too shocking. Because,
No, it's standard today that we start.
Today.
You look at that stuff and you have to look at it with a different framework. You have to understand it then you have to question everything they say. What facts are they selecting to tell? Why are they framing it that way when it doesn't make any sense? If you actually, some of their stuff is just, I found it didn't make any sense at all. And a lot of it also I found when I was reading, they seem to think they can say anything they want and you'll believe them. So Donald Smith is a classic character, right? We seem to think he's great because he banged in a nail on the last nail on the railroad. Oh, sorry, why does that make him a great man? I'm not quite sure what that is, but all I can see is the guy was a great land speculator and not the most truthful character I've ever come across. He was a master of spin, and so, but whoa, Donald Smith said it, so it must be right, and I was thinking, hey, most of what I saw Donald Smith saying was outright propaganda. So, but it's just kind of, how do you look at these stories, and my perspective on it is changed dramatically from my reading.
Yeah, definitely. And it's funny, like, I'm like, I feel like we're just scratching the surface, and, you know, like, and you're so passionate and have a lot of knowledge around everything. And so I'm just super grateful to be able to hear this and have conversation with you. We do have only 5 minutes left, and we have a few questions from the audience. So I am going to switch it over to Wanda now, who will ask a few of the questions, or a question from the audience. So now.
Hi, we have several questions asking about where people can look beside your book to learn more about their Métis family history.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the truth is there's not a lot out there. To get your family history, you can get your genealogy done, but that doesn't tell you what your family did, right? Or much. I mean, it might tell you where they lived or where their kids were born, but it doesn't tell you what their lives were like or what they did. And so the truth is there's a lot of stuff in the archives. The Glenbow has a lot. There are and the St. Boniface archives are the two best collections of things. The Hudson Bay Company has some stuff in it, but after I'd say after 1868 or something, it's kind of not very helpful. So the fact is, if you want to know more about your family, you're going to have to do your own digging. My own take on it, and I have said this to the Métis leadership, is that my book, I'll tell you, the first draft was 1,600 pages, and even then I had already cut hundreds of stories. So if you wanted to tell the real history, like full-on history of the Métis Nation, this is just a popular history, so I wrote it trying to be engaging, and it's like, but if you want to write a really serious history, I think it's 10 volumes probably, and you'd have to include all of the more stories about the people and all the documents and everything. It's a massive story, and so the only thing you can do is try and get your own oral histories down. And I encourage anybody, the minute you find anything, to write it down, because it's the only way we'll have it in the future. Oral history is wonderful, but it gets lost.
Sounds like there's some good opportunities there for people to write more books. Yeah. Another question, the trial transcripts seem to be a central vehicle used in the pedagogy concerning Louis Riel. What do you suggest as an alternative, especially when considering how this document was published by the Crown, etc.? Is there another focus on the archive to direct attention for continued learning, as e.g. Riel's paper, New Nation, etc.?
There are, Riel wrote a fair amount, so there are definitely, St. Boniface Archives has some good stuff in it. The problem with the Riel trial is that, the witness list is very biased and on the wrong side, right? So they never called any of the Métis who were sitting in the prison next door to come and testify at the trial, right? Because everybody had this goal to prove him insane, which Louis fought. So in other words, all he's trying to do is deflect. He's trying to deflect that. And meanwhile, he's trying to tell his own story, but he only gets to speak at the end, and it's not considered evidence. So it's not the best vehicle. No trial is the best vehicle for telling history. So what you have is, you have his writings. We have lots of people who there are lots of, the Le Métis, the newspaper out of St. Boniface for years, was a great source of what was going on. Like I said, Guillaume Charette published a whole bunch of wonderful little pamphlets that are histories of, like, Ambrose Lepine and various people. They're hard to find, but they're there. So there's stuff out there, but you got to dig, and it's not readily available. You can't go to your university library and find it.
Oh, sorry, you're on mute, Wanda.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over to Jadam now to close us out.
Thank you, Wanda. Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, I'm so happy because as we were tuning into the questions from the audience, I was thinking, oh, I really want to touch on whether your opinion around the oral history, because look, if you didn't have the papers, right, and the boxes that were discovered, I always think what you said is very important. To oral history is important, but we need to have, you know, books and papers to be able to refer back to and enrich the history, right?
If I can just say one last thing, it's that the oral history that I knew is basically the shape of the book. So what I was really interested in at the end was the oral history I knew was right. It just didn't have all the detail in it, and it didn't have the facts and the documents to back it up. But in essence, the arc of the oral history that most Métis people knew and know to this day is absolutely correct. There's just a lot more to it, and you can substantiate it as I did with documents, because it's correct.
Well, and that's reassuring as well. That's amazing. So yeah, Nawagoa and Miigwech for taking the time to have a conversation with us about all of this. It's really important, and I've been definitely informed in many different ways through just talking with you. So I'm really grateful, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to
Yes.
participate. Thank you.